Welcome to a very exciting presentation today that the Strauss Center and our program on climate change in Africa, political stability are sponsoring. There's a lot of exciting and fun things we do at the Strauss Center, but somebody laughed. You don't think we do fun, exciting? Is that you, Rachel?
I just missed you, Dr. Gavin.
Oh, pshaw. But one of the best things that we do, or one of the things that really excites us the most, is when we can combine our research, and the exciting cutting-edge research we do, with teaching and education. Of course, we all know this is a big controversy and an issue in the state of Texas. There's this notion that these two things are separate. One of the wonderful things that the CCAPS program does is to combine these two, to have students doing really cutting-edge, first-rate research, working with our top faculty on some of the most important pressing global challenges of the day. And as the CCAPS program has within it funding and support for policy research projects. And today we get to hear some of the results of the year-long efforts that students have been working on in Professor Weaver's class. The course itself, as you know, is called Climate Change and Development in Africa, the 8th Scramble. And from what you will hear today is how the students dealt with a series of really interesting questions. How donors can be held accountable for their promises to orient more aid specifically towards adapting to climate change and the vulnerabilities that climate change poses. What are some of the metrics that can be used, how we can assess how effective this aid is and how it can be utilized more effectively. So I am personally extraordinarily excited by this. I am going to sort of disappear and fade from the scene. Apparently Professor Weaver, who is the real leader, spirit behind this, is also going to fade behind the scene. This is all about the students today. So please join me in thanking the students and welcoming Vera, who I've nominated to be our MC for the presentation today. So thank you very much.
So thank you once again for attending our presentation on our policy research project. The title of the project is Climate Change Aid and Development, the 8th Scramble. So in August of 2010, we set out with three main objectives that we are trying to look into. The first one was to find out, can we track development aid that goes to Africa? The second one was to find a methodology of tracking how much of that development aid is apportioned towards climate change activities. And the third question that we wanted to answer was to have case studies on African countries so we can find out the challenges that they're facing when deploying resources towards climate change adaptation activities. So with these three things in mind, we started off with a project. And through our research, we were able to get partnerships with Aid Data and Development Gateway. And through this partnership, one of the unique things that we did is we got an agreement with the government of Malawi, where we're going to put all their aid projects across all sectors and all donors on a map. This is the first initiative of its kind in any country. So as a result of our research, we have 3 reports and 1 summary brief. These are going to be published by the Strauss Center in summer of this year, and they're going to be disseminated to development practitioners and policymakers around the world. And as we look into this research, the big question is, why does it matter? Why did we even do all this in the first place? So every year, developed countries set aside a portion of their money and give it to poorer countries for the main reason of development. But there's no central place where you can go and find out how much money was given, what was the project that was conducted, where was it conducted, in which town, was it beneficial, what did it do? There's no central place to find that kind of information. But this lack of information becomes even more serious when you think about the fact that developed countries have just agreed that by 2020, they'll be directing $100 billion to developed countries for the sake of climate change activities. So with that amount of money going to these countries, we are concerned about how do we find out this information, how can we make these processes more efficient. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and invite Emily and Amy, who are going to go into in-depth information about our research for the last 9 months. But our presentation will be followed by a Q&A session. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Vera. I'm Amy, and this is Emily, and we're going to present what is our framework report, in other words, sort of the overarching report on the main objectives, methodology, findings, and challenges of our research. And this report will also serve as an introduction for the presentations by our case study teams, which will follow. So as Vera briefly introduced, since August we've been pursuing several main objectives. The central objective was to figure out just how much adaptation aid currently exists for Africa. So when we say adaptation aid, I can give you an example of the definition from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is that adaptation is actions which are taken to help communities adapt to changing climate conditions. So for example, you could build a seawall for a community that is in a coastal area and might face rising sea levels, or you could plant drought-resistant crops in areas that are facing warmer temperatures and drier soils. So these are some examples of adaptation. When we say adaptation aid, we mean money which is going towards these types of activities. So it's very important that we can track these types of activities because communities in Africa are some of the most vulnerable communities in the world to these types of threats and some of the ones that are least able to cope with those risks. So Vera also mentioned that this is important because billions of dollars of money are going to this in coming years. And we want to know if donors who have committed these funds are really providing them. So we're asking who is providing aid? Are they meeting the commitments that they pledged under the UN FCCC? What countries are receiving the aid? Are they going to the communities that really need these projects the most? And what types of activities are they undergoing? So is it a lot of seawalls? Is it a lot of agriculture? Or what types of sectors are most prominent? And also, when we get to our case study countries, we're going to analyze more country-specific questions, which are, how are those countries vulnerable to climate change? What is the state of aid transparency in those countries? Is it easy to track where funds are going? Is the government able to receive all those funds and process them in an effective manner? And finally, is there coordination on the ground between government ministries and NGOs, donors, and recipients? So we used 5 main methodologies to pursue these questions, which were literature review, adaptation coding, geocoding, case studies, and interviews. We thought that this primary and secondary research could be very useful for policymakers because not only did we gain a good sense of who are some of the primary donors and recipients of aid, but we also identified key challenges to accurately tracking aid, which allowed us to come up with some policy prescriptions for how we can improve this process, which we will present at the end of all these presentations. So just to review, our literature review just generally means that since August we've been keeping abreast of all current literature and reports, and we maintained an RSS feed on news of climate change in Africa. And by doing this, we realized that we are making a very new and valuable contribution to the field by being the first to take a comprehensive look at all official aid flows to Africa for the purpose of climate change adaptation in recent years. One of the more technical methodologies we used was adaptation coding, which in general terms means that we would take a project description like the one pictured here, which has a title, maybe the donor and the recipient, the year of the project, and a very short description, maybe 250 characters. And we would look at that description, and we would compare them against 6 different definitions of adaptation provided by development agencies like the OECD or the World Resources Institute, and we would see if based on these definitions, this project counted as adaptation. To ensure reliability, we would have 2 different researchers code each project, and then a 3rd person would arbitrate them. And we looked at over 4,000 projects this way. And we limited our search to projects between 2005 and 2008, so it would be recent, but 2008 was the most recent year for which all data was available. We also looked at geocoding because adaptation coding gave us a sense of the number and the types of projects, but not where those projects were taking place. So by geocoding, we read through project documents looking for names of towns or districts, and then we would assign a latitude and a longitude to that name or that district so that we could map them later on. And as Vera said, our full maps will be available in the summer so you can see the results of those efforts. And we also relied on case studies. We ended up selecting Malawi and Ethiopia as our case study countries, where we conducted 44 interviews with government ministries, NGOs, and other aid experts on the ground. We also conducted interviews in Kenya, Washington, D.C., New York City, with agencies like USAID, the UN Development Program, World Resources Institute, and many others. And we sent a class representative to the UNFCCC Conference of Parties in Cancun so they could present some of our preliminary research and seek feedback. In total, we interviewed about 100 development experts all over the world about this topic, so we gained a lot of feedback from the field about what people were thinking about these topics. And now Emily is going to go over some of the things that we found using these methodologies.
So in our research, we identified over $184 billion going for overall aid to Africa between 2005 and 2008. And the reason why we chose this time period was 2005 was when donors and governments are beginning to talk about adaptation. And then we ended it at 2008 because that is the most recent data that was available to us. So of this $184 billion, we found that approximately $1 billion was going specifically for adaptation. And this was as defined by at least one of the 6 coding schemes that we used in our research. There are approximately 130,000 overall development projects on the continent during this time. And of those, there were about 760 projects that were considered adaptation. So the takeaway from these figures is that there's very little aid going for adaptation on the continent between 2005 and 2008. So based on our research, there's lots of different ways to look at the data. So our first way to look at it is change over time. And this graph shows, you can see an increase in the number of commitments and an increase in the number of projects going to the continent. And so these figures are based on year 2000 dollars. And there's 2 explanations, or at least 2 possible explanations for the reason for this increase in aid for adaptation. One is a growing concern by donor governments about the effects of climate change in Africa. And a second explanation is that this might just be a repackaging of aid. And an example of this repackaging is that before adaptation came into the development scene, a project might have been called as increasing agricultural productivity. Whereas now, under adaptation, the same project might be referred to as increasing agricultural productivity under climate change. So basically, this means, in this case, that the actual activities happening in this specific project are not changing, but just what the project is called is a little bit different. And we found from our research and our interviews in Africa evidence to support both of these explanations. So this next slide shows the difference between recipients. On the map on the left represents total adaptation aid received by each country as defined by at least one of the 6 adaptation or coding schemes that we use in our research. And you can see there's a large variation in the amount of adaptation aid received by each country. Ethiopia, on the right of the map, received over $280 million in adaptation aid. And this accounted for over 27% of all adaptation aid that was going to the continent during this 4-year time period. And just to contrast that and put it in perspective, there were 17 other nations on the continent that received less than $1 million during the same time period for adaptation. So there's really a big difference. On the map on the right shows the number of adaptation projects. And this map shows a little bit of a different story. As you can see that the number of projects are more evenly distributed. And this is due to the difference in size of the actual projects. For example, Ethiopia has several very large projects. And one of these projects has about 10 different donors who are all contributing to a single project. And this particular one gives money for employment for the management of a watershed project. So it's important to remember, no matter if you're looking at all adaptation aid or if you're looking at the number of projects, that adaptation aid accounts for a very small percentage of the overall development aid going to the continent. So this next slide looks at total aid going to each recipient. In the top portion, you can look at the total aid for all kinds of projects, not just adaptation, but overall development. And the bottom portion looks at adaptation aid specifically. Now, there are 5 countries that are on both lists. But what's important to note is that there are several countries that are in one or the other. So basically, the main takeaway from this is that just because a country is receiving a large amount of overall aid for development projects doesn't mean they're necessarily receiving a lot of money for adaptation. And then I also just wanted to point out that our 2 case studies, Ethiopia and Malawi, are both in the top recipients for adaptation aid. So this next way to look at the data looks at the difference between donors. On the left, there's the percentage of all aid given by donors. And this graph shows that bilateral organizations give the most of this kind of aid. Now, when I say about bilateral organization, I mean one country giving money to another country for a specific project. And an example of this kind of organization is USAID. Now, if you look at the graph on the right, this shows the percentage of adaptation aid given by donors. And this tells a little bit of a different story. You can see that multilaterals play a larger role in when we're talking specifically about adaptation aid. And an example of a multilateral organization is the United Nations or the World Bank. And this is an organization where several countries contribute to, and then that organization then distributes the aid to a country. So now that you know a little bit about our research, Amy's going to talk about the challenges in tracking this aid.
So as Emily said, we were able to gain a good sense of the general amounts of aid and types going to the continent, but we also learned a whole lot about the challenges to tracking aid, so that's what we're going to discuss now. One of the main challenges that we encountered was trying to define adaptation aid. So in the beginning of the presentation, I gave you a definition, but that's just one of many definitions that people use to explain what adaptation is. Some people favor narrow definitions with projects that directly reduce exposure to climate risks, like building a seawall. Some people favor broader definitions. For example, you could implement health or education projects in Africa that don't have any direct relation to climate change, but because healthier and well-educated people are better prepared to cope with climate risks, that is, in a sense, an adaptation project. And many of the development experts we spoke with on the ground in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Malawi prefer this broader definition, but they were also very hesitant to allow for double counting. In other words, they don't want people to count the traditional development assistance they're already giving to developing nations also as adaptation aid. They want this funding to be separate and new. This is what we call new and additional funding. So it's hard to say whether funding is new and additional to old funding if we can't really measure the flows that are going on accurately. Another problem is donors don't report very consistently on the location of their projects. So many of the documents we read might say where the district was, but not give a specific town, or they might not update the location of the project throughout the life of the project. They might just say this is where we intend to do it and not fix it later on. Another issue is tracking dispersed aid. So these numbers we've been talking about are committed aid, or what donors report that they pledge to give for these projects. In contrast, dispersed aid is what actually is implemented on the ground and reaches the recipient. And as we will see later on with our case study reports, the channels of aid going from the donor to the recipient are very, very complex, so it's hard to track this money. And very shortly, our 2 case study teams will report on these 2 challenges that we unveiled in our fieldwork, which is that there's a lack of government capacity to process all this new aid, and that there's a lack of coordination between government, donors, and NGOs on the ground to work on these projects. So with that, please welcome Dylan and Sarah to the floor so they can present their findings from their fieldwork in Malawi.
Thanks. Good afternoon. My name is Dylan Malcolm, and I'm from the Department of Geography and was fortunate enough to be part of this PRP, so thank you to the Strauss Center. Sarah and I traveled to Malawi this past March, spent 2 weeks there, and while we were there we conducted 17 interviews with donor organizations, NGOs, and the government in Malawi. We also got to participate in viewing some adaptation projects that are actually happening on the ground, so we got to see what adaptation looks like. There's 3 good reasons why we chose Malawi as a case study country. They're at the right place and the right time based on, 1, they're highly vulnerable. So a climate index that was just published last year said that Malawi was the 15th most vulnerable country in the world. And Mozambique, just to the south of it, was the 5th most vulnerable, and you can see it almost engulfs all of Malawi. So it's a vulnerable country in a vulnerable region. Second, as Amy talked about, Malawi is taking some initiatives to be more aid transparent. This is giving us an opportunity to look at aid going towards adaptation in the inside and sort of determine what it looks like. And third, the conversation on climate change in Malawi is relatively new. So this is allowing us to look at strategies and policies as they're happening. So in Malawi, you'll see that there's a critical link between vulnerability, the aid landscape, and the capacity to respond to climate change. Using the simple definition of vulnerability, we looked critically at what makes resistance to climate change difficult in Malawi. We looked at some of the obvious indicators like floods and droughts. 85% of the population in Malawi is rural, and majority of the population relies on rain-fed maize for not only food, but income. In our conversations with donors, they highlighted several districts. So the districts in yellow are areas along the lakeshore, which not only have persistent drought, but also periodic floods. And the areas highlighted in blue are along the upper and lower Shira River Valley, which also have persistent flooding. Unfortunately for Malawi, because they're so reliant on this rain-fed maize, climate models are predicting an increase in the frequency and intensity of these floods and droughts. Another way to look at vulnerability is to ask Malawians what they see as the cause of climate change. The majority of Malawians think that it's due to deforestation and degradation. Majority of Malawians think the government hasn't done enough to actually protect the forest, and that this is the real cause for climate change. And it makes sense because along the upper and lower Shira River Valley, deforestation leads to soil erosion, which leads to siltation of the river, which leads to overflowing the banks, which leads to crop loss. So there's a long chain of events. I'll just briefly highlight the little district that has green stripes. That's Mulanje. This is Mount Mulanje. It's actually a massif, one of the largest in the world. Very beautiful region in Malawi, but it's also very vulnerable. And you see this distinct line here where deforestation has come up to this mid-level forest boundary. This is actually the boundary of the National Forest Preserve. There's a lot like this in Malawi. And the problem is that donors highlighted the fact that communities living near these areas are actually more vulnerable because they can't access the forest as a coping mechanism. They don't have the access to natural resources that they used to. So donors are focusing a lot on natural preserved boundaries and the communities living around those for future projects. One of the areas that's a little bit less clear in terms of linking it to climate change is poverty and health crisis. So 90% of Malawians live on less than $2 a day. 12% of the population is suffering from HIV and AIDS, and there's 800,000 orphans in this country as a result of the disease. Numerous studies are coming out linking AIDS and poverty to failing crops. So there's interesting studies, and we certainly can't rule it out when we're looking at a complex vulnerability. Population density. You can see the density of Malawi compared to its neighbors. 14 million people, and by 2030 the population is expected to double. When you consider the amount of arable land per person, there's really going to be a food crisis in this country if there's not something done about it. So that's where we sort of combine everything into what we call a complex vulnerability. So Malawi is not just suffering from the environment, not suffering from the weather, not suffering from deforestation, but all these factors combined. And the first year CCAP study created this map for us, but you can see that it really adds some validity based on our interviews and the areas that we found. So the southern region is certainly most vulnerable, the area along the Shira River, and along the north along the lake region. So this is what we get at in terms of identifying vulnerability in Malawi. So in 2006, the conversation on climate change picked up in Malawi. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, encouraged countries, least developed countries like Malawi, to build a national adaptation program of action. And this was twofold. It got countries thinking about adaptation projects in their country. They started identifying immediate and urgent needs, and it also allowed them to access funds through the Least Developed Countries Fund. So I could be mean and say that you need to follow this really closely and there will be a test afterwards. However, it's a pretty complex slide, and you'll see what I mean. So what I want you to take away from it is this whole process is complex. So the National Adaptation Program of Action, the focal point was the Ministry of Natural Resources and Energy. They requested $22 million over 5 years for 5 projects. And those five projects had to deal with reforestation, food security, climate model prediction, disaster risk reduction. And so that's why you have implementing agencies of the Forestry Department and the Ministry of Agriculture. The Global Environmental Facility was handling the funds going in through the Least Developed Country Fund, and the UNDP helped them write this whole program. The problem is they didn't receive any funds from the Least Developed Countries Fund until 2010, just last year. They received $10 million, and they only submitted one proposal for $3 million going to a $27 million African Development Bank project for rural livelihoods. This whole thing was seen as a failure. In fact, a Danish study looked at this and said that they looked specifically at this NAPA and said that this was a failure for many reasons. First, the Ministry of Natural Resources lacked capacity. Second, donors weren't actively involved in this process. You can see a couple donors, but the bulk of donors had nothing to do with this. And the government of Malawi used this lack of funding as an excuse to not continue to build their strategy. So we also, in our interviews, talked with many donors, and we were surprised that they had a lot of negative views about the NAPA. They blamed the projects were out of date, they were out of focus, and they said that the government lacked capacity. So that's where this comes in 2008. The conversation gets a little bit more heated. The National Program for Managing Climate Change. You'll see that donors get a lot more involved. Additionally, you see that the focal point shifts to the Ministry of Development Planning and Coordination. Donors did an independent assessment and found that this department had capacity, and they took a department from the Ministry of Natural Resources to sort of ease tension between these two programs. I don't want you to really see these programs as separate. They occur at different times and they have different focuses, but really this is all connected in Malawi. You'll see that donors are a lot more involved here. All these donors are funding this program and are actively trying to build capacity in Malawi, and they're doing that through the Development Partner Working Group. Another complaint was that the NAPA up there didn't have any research and development arm to it. Nobody was really talking about how the projects were going to affect people and what climate models in the future would look like. So you have direct expertise going into what's called the technical committee, and there's actually a lot of ministries involved in that. But interestingly, while donors are meeting with the government, they're meeting outside of the government with each other, and this brings in other donors as well. So in the Joint Resilience Unit, the donors are meeting with each other, talking about their roles, talking about their projects, and how they're going to sort of shape this new program. And then you have funding mechanisms. So I talked about the Least Developed Country Fund. 10 of the 22 million was released. There was a lot of problem with donors. Well, no problem here. Everyone's giving their money to UNDP, and it's going through the one UN fund, and it's $4 million. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but it's only going to build capacity. It's not going towards projects. So by now you're sort of wondering, hey, this new program is great, but what about the projects? Well, that's where it really gets interesting. So they couldn't get clean development mechanisms in the past, but the donors are helping them, and it has to go through the NAPA because they're the focal point for the UNFCCC funds. But you see all these red lines, and these are donors funding these projects. And the beauty of this, and this is probably my favorite part about it, the 5 projects that they were so critical of, the reforestation, the food security, they're all here. Donors are doing these projects anyway, so they were really critical of the NAPA because they weren't involved, but oh, there's a reforestation project, there's food security and food security there, disaster risk reduction, so the UNDP is involved in that there, and rural livelihoods, and since 1994, USAID has been helping the Meteorological Department forecast climate. So as you can see, this didn't streamline anything like it was supposed to. So donors said that this is going to harmonize and streamline, and it's going to put the government in the lead. So I'll leave you to your opinions on that. But interestingly, like Vera said, $100 billion per year is going to go towards climate adaptation through mechanisms like this. And that's really what I want to leave you with and convey. So donors are critical to any strategy that happens in Malawi. You saw that nothing really happened, there was no traction without them. And so Sarah's going to talk to you about the role of donors, where they participate, and also what adaptation looks like on the ground.
So before looking more specifically at aid going for adaptation in Malawi, it's important to have an understanding of the general aid landscape. So Malawi is very aid dependent. It received close to $800 million in international aid in the most recent fiscal year. And this is actually disbursement information that we got from the Malawian government. And while we were there, we talked to 2 officials, one within the government and one with the UN agency in Malawi, and they told us that foreign aid probably makes up about 40% of the government's budget. And this is a much higher figure than you will find published, and it really illustrates the extent to which the government is reliant on foreign aid from international donors. And also, as you can see from this pie chart, This shows how the government tracks their aid. So they track it by sector. In total, there are 16 sectors. So right now, the sectors receiving the most aid are economic governance, health, and agriculture. But this also illustrates some of the challenges in tracking aid. As you can see, there's not a climate change sector. And adaptation aid falls within many of these different sectors. And thus, it's particularly hard to track, as Amy and Emily already talked about. So using the same adaptation coding methodology that Amy described, we found that about $23 million in official development assistance committed to Malawi from 2005 to 2008 was classified as narrowly defined adaptation aid. And in total, this only represents less than 1% of official development assistance that was going to Malawi during the same time period. So the $800 million that I mentioned in the previous slide, that was international aid for just 1 year. This $23 million is adaptation aid over the course of 4 years. So put in that perspective, this really is not very much money at all. So through doing the adaptation coding, we already understood many of the challenges in tracking this adaptation aid. However, when we traveled to Malawi and we spoke with donors and NGOs, it really helped illustrate some of the key challenges on the ground in trying to track this adaptation aid. One thing we found is that donors are mostly responding to climate change by mainstreaming adaptation into traditional development projects. So this means that they aren't implementing projects that are only focused on climate change adaptation. Instead, these projects have multiple development objectives. Climate change adaptation is just one of them. And many of the development officials we spoke with saw this as a really important strategy for effectively responding to climate change. One official explained to us that you can't just focus on climate change because all of these development issues are interrelated, and they all contribute to the challenges of really responding to climate change. However, the problem is this strategy of mainstreaming makes this aid really hard to track because these projects have many development objectives, and climate change is just one. And the donors don't specify what percentage of these projects is actually going to address distinct adaptation needs. Another thing that we found in Malawi that makes this aid hard to track is that most donors are using food security projects to address adaptation. So food security projects can include a wide variety of strategies. It includes distributing fertilizer and seeds to farmers, helping farmers diversify their crops, working with the community to establish a water management system, and that's just a few of the types of strategies that food security encompasses. The issue is that not all of these strategies actually address the long-term goal of reducing Malawi's vulnerability to climate change. Some are actually just focused on the short-term goal of improving food security. So why is this a problem? Well, first, it poses a problem because this aid is hard to track, because it's hard to differentiate those food security projects that are actually addressing adaptation. And the second issue is that some food security projects are actually counter-effective to adaptation efforts. So for example, if you have a project where you're just aiming to boost maize output in the short term, while you are improving food security, you're actually hindering adaptation efforts because maize is not a very drought-resistant crop. And while we were in Malawi, we decided to see for ourselves what one of these projects looks like on the ground. We were able to do a site visit to a project funded by Norway, focusing on adaptation focusing on food security as an adaptation strategy. And there we found communities doing a variety of things. In one community, we saw farmers that are using agriculture techniques to reduce rainfall runoff. In another community, we saw farmers diversifying their crops away from just relying on maize. And in the last community, we met a farmer who's diversifying his income away from just relying on crops, and he's now raising livestock. So this project helped to illustrate to us that these food security strategies can effectively address adaptation. But the bottom line is still that not all food security strategies do, and thus it's hard to track the aid because it's hard to tell which ones address adaptation and which ones don't. So beyond these challenges with tracking adaptation aid in Malawi, we found two key obstacles that prevent Malawi from effectively responding to climate change. The first thing we found is a lack of government capacity. So one of the reasons the NAPA wasn't implemented successfully is that the government agency that was supposed to lead the effort had severe capacity constraints. And while we were in Malawi, we spoke to an official with the bilateral aid agency who actually told us that there's money that he can access for climate change, but he's hesitant to get this money because he doesn't really feel like the government can even effectively use it for these purposes at this time. In terms of coordination, I think that Dylan's chart pretty much showed that this is a pretty big issue in Malawi. And then within the government, you have a lot of competition between ministries, a lack of harmonization, and this just exacerbates the capacity issues that I already talked about. With donors, you have a few efforts with coordination, but they still really only include a few key donor agencies. So there are some recent efforts that are underway that we saw when we were in Malawi to address these obstacles. Dylan mentioned the National Program for Managing Climate Change. This is actually meant to address both capacity and coordination. But still, from what we found, Malawi is really in the early stages of addressing climate change, and capacity and coordination are the two key issues that really need to be addressed. And now Valerie and Kelly will speak a bit more about these same types of coordination issues as they relate to their case study of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Sarah. I hope everyone's enjoying their Ethiopian lunch. It's one of the perks of studying Ethiopia. Ethiopia is an important case study for our research for three main reasons. First, as mentioned in the framework presentation, Ethiopia is Africa's largest recipient of climate change adaptation aid and the continent's third greatest recipient of foreign aid. Second, Ethiopia is extremely vulnerable to climate shifts because its main source of income is agriculture, which I will discuss a little later in the presentation. Third, Prime Minister Zenawi is an outspoken advocate for the fight against climate change in Africa. He's been chosen by his peers to coordinate numerous conferences on climate change. So based on our in-depth research in Austin and in the field in Africa, we've extracted four main findings regarding climate change adaptation aid in Ethiopia. First, there's a very strong consensus among international development actors regarding the severity of Ethiopia's vulnerability to climate change. Unfortunately, there's no consensus on the definition of adaptation or how to label and track adaptation projects in the field. Though climate change is an important issue on the Ethiopian national agenda, especially to Prime Minister Zenawi, capacity constraints and a lack of institutional coordination are major challenges to effective implementation of adaptation projects on the ground. So through our research, we have delineated three main areas of vulnerability in Ethiopia to climate change. First, Ethiopia is an extremely poor nation with few social services. Around 40% lives on less than $1.25 a day. 50% of Ethiopians aged 15 to 25 are illiterate. So it's not surprising that around 85% of Ethiopia's population is relying on agriculture for income. And unfortunately, agriculture is almost entirely rain-fed. Sporadic rainfalls lead to drought, and when rain does fall, it falls intensively, leading to flooding. A third area of vulnerability within Ethiopia is a lack of new technology, especially irrigation. Despite Ethiopia's vast water resources, only 13% of irrigable land in Ethiopia is currently irrigated, and antiquated farming practices such as ox-drawn plows are common, while fertilizers and pesticides, which are technology that aren't so new, are rare. So almost all international development actors agree that vulnerable populations, the most vulnerable populations, are those residing in food insecure districts. Unfortunately, opinions greatly vary on what regions should be prioritized and how these regions should be prioritized and defined as food insecure. So this is a symptom of coordination challenges that Kelly will speak about more in depth. Kelly?
So in Ethiopia, we see that there's a consensus on vulnerability, and there's also a consensus that climate change is something that needs to be addressed. It's been a part of the development plans in Ethiopia for some time now. The previous development plan from 2005 to 2010, which is the plan for accelerated and sustainable development to end poverty, didn't directly address climate change, but it did incorporate it into some of its development plans. Many of the projects that were outlined in the plan were those that could be classified as adaptation by today's terms. Their current development plan, the Growth and Transformation Plan, does directly address climate variability and change throughout the plan. It talks about addressing food insecurity through adaptation projects, as well as building a carbon neutral economy against future climate change threats. To that end, the Ethiopian Environmental Protection Authority has been developing a new plan. The EPA is the new responsible agency for climate change in Ethiopia. And they feel that since the National Adaptation Program that was developed with the World Bank did not include their input, they intend to replace it with a new plan. And this plan outlines 20 specific problems caused by climate change and assigns responsibility for them to the relevant sectoral ministries. The plan also outlines a plan to devolve responsibility for planning and implementation to the local levels. So the EPA's national plan will serve as a guideline for the regional plans that will actually take into consideration the context and specific problems of each location. When we look at accounting for adaptation aid funds, we see several challenges, and these have already come up in the previous two talks that you heard today. The first is that there's no common definition for adaptation. Donors are all using a different idea of what should be done for adaptation and what constitutes adaptation. What may be food insecurity to one agency is adaptation to another, and this causes problems when tracking how much we're spending on these projects. The second thing is that we're relabeling rather than redesigning development projects. So when the trends changed and we decided adaptation was what we were going to do in Ethiopia, many people just took existing projects, recategorized them, and the projects remained the same. So as you saw when Emily showed you the graph of increasing funding for adaptation, actually the profile of the development remains the same. And then we see that a lot of organizations are funneling new climate funds to existing development frameworks. We heard from multiple people that adaptation is not a standalone project and shouldn't be to be effective. It needs to be part of development as a whole. But that means that when you're putting it with existing funding, it's difficult to determine how much we're spending on adaptation versus development as a whole. In Ethiopia, the specific challenges that we really saw were challenges of capacity and coordination. And with capacity, there are several constraints. The EPA, as I said before, has recently been named by the Prime Minister as the agency responsible for the planning of climate change and the direction of the adaptation effort. But when they were given these responsibilities, they were not given a corresponding larger staff and larger budget. So they're still working with a very small staff, and they lack resources. Within that staff, they only have 2 experts with climate change, which limits their ability to really respond to what's going on in the country. Also, the EPA is not an implementing agency, but rather just a planning agency, which limits its abilities to react to climate change as well. And then we also see that in Ethiopia, there's a problem of brain drain. The best and brightest of Ethiopians are being hired by donors who can pay more and give better benefits, which leaves the government with some of the less capable workers and limits their capacity for adapting. We're doing a few things already to respond to this. The UK Agency for International Development, DFID, and the UN Development Program are both already funding projects that directly invest in the government of Ethiopia's capacity to adapt by building their staffs and budgets and training. So with coordination, we see right here, this is how it's supposed to work, and it's rather complex. Within the government, the Prime Minister is the end-all, be-all decision-making, and he's designated, as I said before, the Ethiopian Environmental Protection Agency as the one to take care of the planning for adaptation. So the EPA develops plans for climate change, takes them to the sectoral ministries that are relevant, and has them approve it with their expertise. And when they send the plans back to the EPA, they become part of official adaptation policy. And the Prime Minister may also sometimes go straight to a sectoral ministry with specific projects. Within the donor community, we have a vast number of donors in Ethiopia. Here we've labeled some of the top ones. The UNDP, DFID, and the World Bank are the top 3 donors for climate change in Ethiopia, and USAID is a major donor as well. Each of these donors individually approaches the government to have approval for projects, and the government comes to them for funding for specific initiatives that they're interested in undertaking. And then both of these organizations, groups, go to non-governmental organizations and civil society organizations to help with implementation. And there's a little bit of a reciprocal relationship here as well, because these NGOs and CSOs sometimes can give back information on feedback from the local level or context-specific information about a problem that should be addressed, which may influence the policies of donors or the government. But largely the relationship works towards them as opposed to returning information. And we also see that although many people use NGOs and CSOs for implementation, donors may sometimes implement themselves as well as the government. In reality, however, this triangle is a little less smooth, and we have problems both within each group of funders as well as between them. Within the Ethiopian government, we see that there's a competition between ministries for resources and leadership roles, which creates a lot of inefficiency as they spend time competing as opposed to addressing problems. There's also little communication between ministries, so sometimes we get redundant projects or a failure to take advantage of other agencies' expertise when addressing a problem. The EPA also, after being chosen as the responsible agency for climate change, began trying to crowd out other ministries. And this is a major problem because, as we know, climate change is a multi-sectoral problem. The EPA can't handle all of the problem by itself, and it needs to go to the other ministries for help, but it's not doing that. It's trying to take all the credit and all the time and money for itself. The EPA is also not accountable to other government ministries. While the ministries themselves are set up in a network together, the EPA is a separate authority that does not answer to those ministries and only answers primarily to the Prime Minister, which means that they don't have to listen to the expertise of these ministries. And then finally, the EPA has the problem of being spatially limited to Addis Ababa. There's only one office of the EPA in the capital city, whereas most of the adaptation projects and problems take place outside of Addis Ababa, and the EPA just can't get there. In the donor community, we have another set of problems with coordination and communication. Donors aren't talking about what they're doing in Ethiopia. So there's this lack of communication means that a lot of donors are funding the same things, sometimes even in the same areas, without sharing that information or working together. Donors are also pursuing their own agendas, and we had one World Bank official call this letting their flags fly high. As opposed to working for the betterment of Ethiopia, they're working for the betterment of their own national agenda and their aid profile. And this becomes even more problematic when we consider that climate change policy is set by headquarters as opposed to field offices. Field offices are more aware of what needs to be done on the ground, but headquarters is the one who tells them what the priorities need to be for projects. So often these policies are set without any representation of the actual problems in the country. And then finally, although there's an acknowledgement by donors of the lack of coordination and the importance of developing that communication, there's a reluctance to expend resources to lead the donor coordination effort. No one's willing to have it be their staff and their time that's spent on convening meetings, although they know it's important. And there's been a few attempts to create forums for coordination by NGOs and CSOs, but these attempts have been limited by resources and time. These organizations simply aren't big enough to handle this problem. Finally, we have a few problems between the coordination between donors and government. Donors often, because of the lack of communication and harmonization of agenda, they're approaching the government unilaterally, which limits the government's capacity as they're spending so much time dealing with each individual donor in a country with a large number of donors. Donors also sometimes may bypass the EPA, which the EPA is the agency that needs to be worked with on adaptation, but many donors have pre-existing relationships with other ministries that they feel more comfortable about working with, and they have experience in working with. For example, USAID works with the Ministry of Agriculture and has done extensively for many decades, and yet now they have to switch their relationships, and there's sometimes a pushback against doing that. And then finally, there's a power imbalance. Whereas the government needs to be the one setting the priorities and deciding what kind of projects need to be pursued in Ethiopia, in reality, the donors are the ones that hold the money, and the government allows them to set the agenda on programs and projects. So there is a large number of things going on, but there are things we can do, and I'd like to invite Jess now to come up and tell us where we go from here.
Okay, I will present our policy prescriptions for how we can address the key challenges that were discussed in the framework macro study and also our Ethiopia and Malawi case studies. First, we have this problem of defining adaptation. There is a lack of consensus on the definition of adaptation, so we need to define this word adaptation. Without a definition, there's no way that we can accurately measure the current levels of adaptation aid. Therefore, the UNFCCC could lead this process. What would need to happen is there needs to be a renewed discussion, a dialogue between climate change experts and development experts, and they need to figure out
which one of these many different definitions are the best to move forward. Our second major challenge is the coordination between actors. As we saw in Dylan's very complex map and also Kelly's triangle of coordination, it's very difficult to track aid from the donors to the projects. So this disconnect can cause duplication of projects, it can cause inefficient spending and implementation of projects that are not actually what this community needs. Therefore, the Ethiopian team found that one way to promote better coordination is through what the World Bank calls mega projects. These mega projects are one national level incentive, so one project with a whole bunch of different donors, with one oversight body of maybe a board of international organizations. And this would require a standard standardization of the reportings, and it would also help to better track aid. We could funnel channel the funds through maybe the Global Environmental Fund, or through the focal institutions such as the World Bank or the UNDP. Our third major challenge with is building capacity. So as the Malawi team told us, some donors actually have funds, but they don't want to release them to the government because maybe the government does not have the capacity to handle these increased aid flows. So donors need to support these governments. Aid agencies should promote training and increase administrative funding support. Our fourth major challenge is transparency. So in general, all of these contribute to increased and overall aid transparency. As we saw in Dylan's complex map of Malawi, it's very difficult to track this aid. But by increasing aid reporting, we can improve transparency. We encourage aid agencies and NGOs to adhere to the guidelines set by movements such as the International Aid Transparency Initiative. Finally, aid agencies and governments need more learning from the ground up. They should gather best practices from the field and be more creative with their solutions. Our Ethiopia and Malawi teams witnessed enthusiastic farmers who were excited to experiment with new strategies and new technologies. And also we witnessed many local NGOs that have a wealth of knowledge about what's going on the ground and what local communities need most. There are also leaders like the World Bank who are at least trying to quantify the percentage of adaptation aid in their projects. So finally, we have hope for change as long as the donors and the recipients continue to focus on aid transparency and reporting in this aid process. And I would like to thank you all for coming to our presentation and invite our members for the Q&A. If you have questions about the framework, you can ask Pace. And questions about Malawi, you can ask Kor and Gigi. And for Ethiopia, you can ask Nancy and Catherine.
Okay, you can go ahead and answer a few questions. You can go ahead.
Yeah, a couple of questions. First of all, it's a wonderful presentation, wonderful project. My judgment is that the transparency aspect is the single biggest contribution. There's a pretty complex problem. And simply putting a little light on some of these issues is the best thing you could possibly do. There are two kinds of questions. One, the difference between commitments and disbursements. This is referred to earlier. Aid agencies, bilateral and multilateral, are notorious for wildly inflating their aid figures. I'm guessing that 184 billion is off by a factor of 10, if not more. So it's part of the question of the difference between what's actually dispersed. More importantly, it's a distinction between loans and lines of credit on the one hand and grant aid on the other. And typically there are enormous lines of credit out there at prevailing world market rates that these countries couldn't avail themselves of if they wanted to. So it stands there to make donors feel good about themselves, but it doesn't get anywhere near the problem. The second issue is on the question of coordination, which, as you say, is a huge problem. And it really is, much of it is structural. A lot of that cannot be, as a legal matter, untangled. When aid accounts for 40% of the government's intake, this is a huge issue inside governments. I used to negotiate with the whole cabinet of Slovakia because they couldn't decide who spoke for the government. So what does coordination really mean here? You sort of got at it, sort of the coordination on a single multi-donor big projects. That's one kind of coordination. Strategic coordination, whereby the big donors sort of agree on what they're trying to do in the country, is another. Are there other things that came up in your recommendations to sort of define what coordination might actually be feasible?
Well, I'll answer the first two questions. So the difference between commitments and disbursements, we just looked at commitments. So this is donors saying, so we looked at between 2005 and 2008. So this was money committed in those years, not dispersed in those years. And why we looked at commitments is for practical reasons. So the commitment numbers are what donors report. So we can easily access those numbers. They don't report on what was actually dispersed and where it went. So while you could potentially find that information out by going to them and talking to them after the fact, that would have taken years of labor to do that for those same 4 years. So for that reason, we looked at commitments. And then you also ask about the loans. So what we're looking at is what's considered official development assistance. And so there's a number of criteria for that, which is different from foreign assistance. So foreign assistance can go to richer countries, and it can also have loans at prevailing market rates, whereas official development assistance can't. So it's a little more limited in that sense.
And just to follow up from that, we actually managed to get information about disbursement from the government of Malawi. So that's what you saw in our part of the presentation talking about disbursement. And obviously, we have no way of verifying these actual numbers. This was just numbers that were reported by the government themselves, saying that this is the money that we are using towards X, Y, and Z sector. Moving on to coordination, there's several coordination problems, as we highlighted already. There's problems between donors themselves, between donor and governments, and then between donors, governments, and the nonprofit and civil society. So there's issues of defining the agenda, what needs to be done, and then reaching a consensus. In terms of Malawi, they do have the donor working group and the joint resilience unit, which meet on a pretty regular basis. In terms of what really comes out of it is pretty debatable. The donors are still skeptical of how productive these meetings actually are, but we see this at least as a step forward in increasing coordination in the country.
I think for Ethiopia, what we saw a lot was that there were similar efforts in terms of planning, in terms of really driving the agenda, but almost all of the donors that we talked to, as well as implementing agencies, their biggest complaint was that they didn't know what anybody else was doing on the ground. So, even at the national level, and especially with a prominent figure like Prime Minister Zenawi, you had people who were generally focusing in the same areas, but I mean, you could go out into the field in a location where you planned a project and somebody may have implemented the same or a different project in that location. So there was just this, there was no resource for them in terms of who's doing what and where in the country.
Yeah.
I have a question that I'll direct mainly towards the Malawi team, but it's open for all of the teams. And I'm also asking this question somewhat on behalf of next year's PRP. So I'd like to have a little bit more detail on what you saw specifically as the capacity constraints within the government. I got a little bit less of that from the Malawi presentation than from the Ethiopia presentation. And whether you see capacity constraints just as not enough staff and not enough training in climate change, or whether you also see capacity constraints as linked to this question of coordination, whether there are issues about how people within the government know how to interact with other actors in coordinating their activities, whether there are actual skills that exist within the government to do that, or whether that in and of itself is a capacity constraint within government that then helps to lead to these coordination problems.
Well, in terms of capacity, as Sarah mentioned in our presentation, that we had a bilateral donor who had access to climate change funds but did not because he was unsure of the capacity. And just from talking to the donors, the way they were defining capacity was just being equipped to use those funds for different projects, specifically in regards to climate change. They were not as specific as you're delineating that right now. What we understood was just in terms of the committee that is now in charge of the climate change program, which was the Development and Planning Committee. It's not actually an implementing agency, which has been put in charge of this major project. It's just a coordinating agency, which is, and because there's still competition for funds, it struggles to coordinate amongst the different ministries in the government in regards to climate change. I do not have a specific way of defining capacity in that sense because that's when it was referred to as a capacity problem. That's pretty much all they kept saying. We have a capacity problem.
I would just add on to that. You mentioned, you asked about just kind of the technical knowledge of climate change and expertise in that field. And I think we definitely got the sense that that was lacking, maybe if not on an individual level. Some donors, including Norway, did mention that there are individuals within these ministries that are highly competent and have a lot of knowledge in the field, but that kind of competence and knowledge so far have not been institutionalized. So just in terms of the ministry's daily operations, I think there is a lack of training and education on the topic.
Yes.
So trying to sit here in the shoes of the donor and thinking about what's the takeaway in terms of financing these projects, I'm a little, sort of, I think, not confused, but sort of stuck in that you emphasize there's a low percentage going to climate adaptation, or what you can find, there seems to be a low percentage. And so the takeaway seems to be that more money needs to be going there. But then you also say that a lot of it seems to be tied up in development aid, so actually there's probably more than we can actually measure. So if you're sort of talking to the donor, what's the takeaway? We need to be putting more money into climate adaptation, or we need to be thinking more about how climate adaptation is being sort of addressed in development aid, or is there a good figure? I guess I come away from it saying, okay, we need to increase it, but what's a good level to increase it to? Or can you kind of address that question of what sort of the takeaway is for the donor in terms of the money? You talk a lot about that.
Well, I'm not sure about the takeaway from the donor's perspective, but overall the takeaway is that developed countries have committed $100 billion a year by, which is more than doubling the aid we give now. And so they're committing that per year by 2020. So that's going to assist with climate change. So we need to know, well, what is that actually going to? So you're giving that in addition to the aid that's already being given for climate change, but what are the actual projects that it's going to be funded. And so what we're finding is that right now there's no mechanism to distinguish between normal aid and climate change aid. So if we are going to keep track of that money, there needs to be some sort of separation there. So whether that needs to start at the donor level or start at some higher institutional level is yet to be determined.
So, I guess this is sort of to the Ethiopia team, but maybe to all of you. To what extent is the African Union engaged on this issue?
Sure. The African Union, we mainly focused on Ethiopia-specific bilateral coordination efforts in climate change within Ethiopia. But the African Union is involved, and there are definitely regional and Pan-African initiatives. There's something called the African Climate Policy Center, I believe, the ACPC. That's an effort between the African Development Bank, the UN, the UNECA, and the AU. And they are trying to build capacity and give technical expertise to all of African nations. So there are a lot of initiatives like that within Addis, because it's the seat of the AU. But outside of that, we didn't focus on regional or Pan-African efforts, mainly just within Ethiopia.
I think just to kind of touch on that, most of these efforts that we heard about, like this ACPC, are multi-donor trust fund style of project, and so they're really garnering funds from all kinds of different agencies. And then the idea is, at least moving forward, most of the ones that we heard about were new, so the idea going forward is that the control for those will be actual African political leaders, prime ministers in Malawi, but also regional leaders in terms of delineating the funds and which projects those go to. So trying to put money towards that, but also give them the control over where it goes and how to allocate it.
Yeah, and several donors mentioned the importance of strengthening the African institutions, like doing it through the African Union as opposed to the UN or something more international.
So I think we have time for one or two more questions. Ambassador McMahon.
I'd like to thank the presenters and you as well for a highly professional presentation. I've sat through professional, real-life presentations that haven't been this informative or professional, so thank you all. I particularly like the diagrams and charts trying to map out the donor-recipient project nexus. That's very, very well done, show the complexities in this. It seems that capacity and coordination are repeated themes that we hear when looking at adaptation aid, and it's trying to map it and to gauge its potential effectiveness. And I think that if you were looking at water and sanitation issues, public health issues, agricultural development issues, that these two things, coordination and capacity, would also be heard in those discussions to varying degrees. I remain somewhat skeptical that foreign assistance can cause development. And when we see this repeated, the hurdles of coordination and capacity in developing countries, one wonders if outside donors can cause this. So I like Jess's comment, the last thing on her policy prescription was to try to gather best practices from the field, to give us some hope or some optimism that maybe this is doable. And can I ask the two teams from Malawi and Ethiopia, if they came across mechanisms or projects that seem to fit into this best practices category that might give us some optimism that this could be plausible?
Well, I think for Malawi, at least, conservation agriculture is really has become a growing focus of donors who are trying to work in the adaptation field. And we, during our field visit, we were fortunate enough to really see how this was being done on the ground. And as Sarah earlier had already mentioned, there's actually quite a bit of enthusiasm from farmers who were very interested to learn maybe about the new techniques and from the NGOs and as well as donors such as Norway that are trying to push for conservation agriculture. One farmer we talked to told us that he heard on a radio program about this local NGO, Total Land Care, that is trying to implement projects, conservation agriculture projects funded by Norway. And he was interested, but was a little bit skeptical in the beginning. So what he did was to divide his land
in three different portions.
In three different portions. One third, he was just using the traditional techniques that he's always used. 1/3, he did.
1/3 was basically using the conservation agriculture techniques, and then the other half, or the rest of the 1/3 of it, was using contours instead of ridges. So there was like 3 different ways that he was using to see the variations between the different techniques that were being used. And this was the same farmer that Sarah mentioned was not only diversifying his crops and techniques, but also diversifying income. So he had use of livestock in terms of diversifying his income. So when we saw these 3 different parts of the land, you could very clearly see that the conservation agriculture patch of the land had the highest and most green maize, and in terms of quality and quantity. However, we were not able to control against the fact that over the past couple of years, rain has been very good in Malawi, and these farmers are using fertilizers and pesticides. So it's difficult to really judge if the actual adaptation techniques are really taking effect, or it is just the good rain that Malawi has been experiencing. But the farmers that we spoke to, as Gigi mentioned, were very enthusiastic about these different techniques and are, taking on these different adaptation efforts. So there's clearly a move forward.
And as far as within Ethiopia, we did see an example that donors point to several times of effective coordination. And that is with the largest development project within the country. It's called the Productive Safety Net Program. And it was mentioned in the presentations, but there's 10 major donors. It covers millions of people within the country. It's in every region. And how it works is all the money is pooled into a multi-donor trust fund. And there's an intermediary, there's a donor coordination team, and they're housed in the World Bank. And we met with the leader of that team, and he worked between the government and the donors. So it wasn't all 10 donors going to the government one at a time. There was one intermediary that went between the donors and the government. So a lot of people pointed to that as maybe we need to do something like that, create a multi-donor trust fund for climate change funds. So there were examples of coordination, but just single incidences of it, not systematic.
But I think your question points to a larger concern. So because of the industrial development in the West, we have climate change, which we're pretty certain is going to cause harm in Africa. So we say, well, let's give money to Africa to offset the problems that we're causing through climate change. However, if you're someone like Ambassador McMullen or other people who are skeptical that these foreign aid tools can actually solve any problems, it leaves you sort of in a state of despair. We're giving this money to offset the problems we've caused, but we don't know if these tools are how effective they'll be in doing that.
So thank you, everyone. That's all we have time for
That's so depressing.
Yeah, we would like to end on a better note, but we really thank you for attending our presentation. We did have a lot of fun doing this over the last 9 months. And I guess if you have miscellaneous questions, you can direct them to Professor Weaver.
Or one of us.
Yeah, or one of us. But thank you so much for attending our presentation.